And I don't want to miss the chance to read and to hear the sounds of Torah. So please stick with me as we hear some of that, without Aliyah and without Torah scroll, but it's just so pretty. I want you to hear it. Vayiyu Chayei Sarah 100 shanim ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shanim shnei Chayei Sarah vatamot Sarah b'kiryat Arba hi Chevron be'eretz Canaan vayavo Avraham Lispod lesara veliv kota vayakom Avraham me'al pnei meto vaydaber el bnei chet lemor ger vetoshav anochi imachem tenoli achuzat kever imachem ve'ekbera meti milfanai vayanu v'nei chet et Avraham lemor lo shema'enu Adoni nasi Elohim ata betochenu b'mivchar kivarenu kivor et metecha ish mimenu et kivro lo yichle mimcha mikvor metecha vayakom Avraham vayishtachu la'am haaretz livnei chet vaydaber itam lemor im yesh et nafshechem likbor et meti milfanai shema'uni ufiguli be'efron ben sochar vayiten li et me'arad hamachpelah asher lo asher bekitzei sadehu bekesef malei vayitneina li betochechem la'achuzat kaver ve'efron yoshev betoch b'nei chet vayan Efron achiti et Avraham beoznei v'nei chet lechol bahei sha'ar iro lemor lo Adoni shema'eni hasadei netati lach ve'ha'amara asher bo lecha netatiha le'enei v'nei ami netatiha lach kivor metecha vayishtachavu Avraham lifnei am haaretz vaydaber el Efron beoznei am haaretz lemor ach imatalu shema'ini natati kesef hasadeh kach mimeni ve'ekbera et meti shama vayan Efron et Avraham lemor lo Adoni shema'eni eretz arpe me'ot shekel kesef beni uvencha mahi ve'et metcha kivor vayishma Avraham el Efron vayishkol Avraham le'Efron et hakesef asher diber beoznei v'nei chet 400 shekel v'chesef העובר לסוחר. The passage that we've just read from Parshat Chayei tells us of the life and of the death of our matriarch Sarah. It says, "Vayiyu Chayei Sarah me'ah shana ve'esrim shana u'sheva me'ot shanim shenei Chayei Sarah." Sarah's lifetime, the years of her life, came to 127 years were the years of her life. Rabbi Sachs comments on this that this is a classic and typical Jewish way of handling death. Matter-of-factly, talking about the span and the use of that time, and then to emphasize yet again life. And hence we call this parsha Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, though it's actually about her death. And then the pasuk ends again with the phrase, Shenei Chayei Sarah, were the years of Sarah's life. Rather than talking primarily about her death, which of course we will busy ourselves with, we contemplate Sarah's life. This week, 1 week ago, we also lost one of the Gidulei Torah, one of the great sages of Torah in our generation. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs passed last Shabbat, around the time that we were praying for his health. He passed away in the United Kingdom. And this is a loss that affects me personally. For me, Rabbi Sachs was someone who functioned as a mentor in how to teach Torah. I didn't know him personally, but Rabbi Sachs was the model that I would look to for how to teach Torah in our time to the issues that we face. He was a model for me in so many aspects of how I think. On this week's parashah, which he prepared beforehand, he already had written out actually all the Torah for this coming year before he passed. He had prepared it, and he wrote the following about Abraham and Sarah. This is an extraordinary example of his oratory, his ability to make the parsha speak to us today. He wrote, Abraham and Sarah were among the supreme examples in all of history of what it is to have a why in life. The entire course of their lives came as a response to a call, a divine voice that told them to leave their home and their family, to set out for an unknown destination, to go live in a land where they would be strangers, and abandon every conventional form of security and have the faith to believe that by living by the standards of righteousness and justice, they would be taking the first step toward establishing a nation, a land, a faith, and a way of life that would be a blessing to all humankind. When Rabbi Sachs would read the parashah and give us his beautiful interpretations of it, he would more frequently than perhaps any other commentator I know tell us the why of the parsha. Rabbi Sachs's teaching starts with the why, and in a very famous set of videos, he would actually address that it is crucial to address the why. One of my favorite teachings of his is called Why I Am Jewish. It actually has a bunch of, it has like a cartoon that's like sketching out the scenes. It's about 6 minutes, and it's one of the most powerful teachings on Jewish identity that I've seen, but it's so much more than just Jewish identity. It is really resounding with the sound of faith. That's a lot of what Rabbi Sachs was able to give in the context of a modern and a postmodern world. He presented a profound why be Jewish. He answered that question in beautiful and compelling ways. As we think about this week's Parsha, we might also think about the question, how do you want to be remembered? When we come to the story of the passing of Sarah, it rightly poses such questions. Questions about the meaning of life and of death. And death requires that each of us mortals come to some kind of answer to that. What will be the meaning? I want to suggest that people will primarily remember you by your why. Why did you do things? Why did you get involved in your synagogue? Why did you not? Why did you work? Why did you not? Why did you raise a family or not? Those are the things that people will remember about you. There's the why, and Rabbi Sachs led. The other aspect by which people might remember you is not why you did things, but how you did them or said them. This is a powerful thing that's increasingly becoming clear about politicians and about orators, that people don't really remember what you said. They don't necessarily remember what you stood for, but they do remember how you said it, how you did it. And I want you to think about also the how of your practices, your Jewish practices. Are your practices something that communicates something big and beautiful and compelling to your children and to those around you? Or does it communicate that you're rushing to get done with it? That you already, in some sense, were done with it a long time ago? These are crucial questions for each of us to think about, right? Rabbi Sachs was an orator and a thinker and a statesman. Rabbi Sachs is one of the most beautiful teachers. His language is just brimming with brilliance. Take, for example, what he wrote in this book, which we'll be studying here in his honor in the coming months, this book called The Great Partnership, Science, Religion, and the Search for Meaning. He writes in the opening lines, in a beautiful and powerful and compelling way that already holds within it the germ of the answer to the struggle between science and religion that so many people founder upon. They think that their own attempts to have a spiritual life founders on this. They think, religion has to be in conflict with science. No. Rabbi Sachs handles it this way in his introduction. If the new atheists are right, you would have to be sad, mad, or bad to believe in God and practice a religious faith. We know that it is not so. Religion has inspired individuals to moral greatness, consecrated their love, and helped them to build communities where individuals are cherished and great works of loving kindness are performed. The Bible first taught the sanctity of life, the dignity of the individual, and the imperative of peace and the moral limits of power. To believe in God, faith, and the importance of religious practice does not involve an abdication of the intellect, a silencing of critical faculties, or believing in 6 impossible things before breakfast. It does not involve reading Genesis 1 literally. It does not involve rejecting the findings of science. I come from a religious tradition where we make a blessing over great scientists, regardless of their views on religion. Rabbi Sachs is able to summarize in 2 paragraphs that you've just heard the answer to the false dichotomy between religion and science. Do you believe in religion or in science? You hear it all the time on American campuses. Rabbi Sachs was not just a great orator, he was also a great thinker. Rabbi Sachs was able to think about the questions of our time and to pose serious problems in his Divrei Torah that engaged with questions that we need to grapple with right now. At the same time, he did it with such grace, with such eloquence, that he didn't have to upset anyone. I want you to hear how he would do that as he speaks in defense of, or as he speaks illuminating a crucial issue that we still struggle with in our society right now, and yet he does it without hurting the feelings of those wherever they stand on the political spectrum. He's a profound thinker, a profound orator, and a profound statesman at the same time. On Parashat Behar Bechukotai, he has the following to say. The fundamental insight of Parashat Behar is precisely what was stated by Thomas Piketty. He's referring to a book called Capital in the 20th century by Thomas Piketty, which was a major piece of work to summarize 100 years of economic history. And this book was much discussed, and it is a very important book because it's a summary of data that's easily accessible to people about the value of capital within a society versus the value of labor. And he argues that capital is rising, the value of capital is rising higher, more quickly than that of labor, and that is impoverishing many people while enriching others. So Rabbi Sachs engages him and says, the fundamental insight of Parshat Behar is precisely what was restated by Piketty, namely that economic inequalities have a tendency to increase over time, and the result may be a loss of freedom as well. People can become enslaved by a burden of debt. In biblical times, this might involve selling yourself literally into slavery as the only way of guaranteeing food and shelter. Families might be forced into selling their land, their ancestral inheritance from the days of Moses. The result would be a society in which, in the course of time, a few would become substantial landowners, while many would become landless and impoverished. The Torah's solution set out in Behar is a periodic restoration of people's fundamental liberties. Every 7th year, debts were to be released, and Israelite slaves set free. After 7 sabbatical cycles, the Jubilee year was to be a time when, with few exceptions, ancestral land returned to its original owners. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia is engraved with the famous words of the Jubilee command. Proclaim, call out liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Incredibly relevant, this vision remains in our own time. Wow, there is Rabbi Lord Sachs speaking to one of the thorniest issues of our time, something that, while it may be ignored, needs to be thought about by academics, by economists, by policymakers, by statesmen, by politicians, by each of us. And yet he handles it within the framing of Torah, such that he's not taking a side primarily to offend some group or advance the interests of his own. He handles it like a statesman. No one need go away with hurt feelings. We just need to think about this issue. Let me provide parameters within which we might think. That's extraordinary. That's something that some of my favorite teachers of Torah can do, like Rabbi Ethan Tucker, with whom I consulted about Kaddish. That's something that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs did brilliantly throughout his lengthy period of working as the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, and then simply in his standing as a public intellectual with something to say to all of us, particularly within the English-speaking West. There's an interview that I think brilliantly shows the difference between him as a statesman and, say, those who busy themselves with mere political commentary. There's an interview that he gave at the 92nd Y in which David Brooks, the New York Times columnist, was interviewing him. And the two men were clearly enjoying each other's company. They really had a strong rapport. They seemed to agree on a huge number of things. They're asking questions. There was an interesting give and take. And then David Brooks comes to the following questions. He said, I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about our president. So what do you think about President Trump? And Sachs sort of leaves a long silence, which he doesn't often do. He's normally ready to go right away. There's a downbeat there. And he tells a story. And he says, when I had just become the chief rabbi of England, I was giving a talk and it went well, and at the end we had a question and answer period, and a young couple stood up and they said, we're an interfaith couple, one of us is Jewish and one of us is not, and we got married, but we'd like you to tell us what would it be like for us at your synagogue if we came to you to get married? And Rabbi Sachs, sort of smiling and looking back at the couple with a twinkle in his eye, says, they wouldn't have made me chief rabbi if I didn't know how to avoid answering questions like that. That was his answer to David Brooks at the 92nd Y. No, I'm not going to be drawn into critiquing or giving my opinion on the president. Rabbi Sachs has made it abundantly clear how he thinks and what the Torah teaches, and you, the audience, can take that teaching and apply it also to the president. But he knows that he doesn't need to do that for a thoughtful public. I know that I don't need to tell you what to do with the Torah. You can figure it out. There's been a question that some people ask me, which is, why, if you, Rabbi, are preaching to things that have to do with our political situation today, don't you just come out and say what you think? Just say what you think and feel about politics today. That was, in effect, the question that Brooks was posing to Rabbi Sachs. Why didn't he do it? If he doesn't honor your ability as a thinking person to take in the values of Torah and apply it, then you're just going to start a debate with him. I don't like how you put that. That wasn't quite fair-minded. That's too stern a critique, right? You're leaving out other values. That's what we love to do in our political discourse in our nation. Sachs was so much more than a political commentator. He was not a politico. He was a statesman. He was someone that understood that the interest of the state had to engage common interests, had to establish common ground so that we as a people can move forward together. One of the most repeated critiques that he gave of politics, without pointing fingers at specific people or naming names, was he said, today's politicians are too political. What he meant by that was that there's a kind of narrow self-interest about oneself or about one's party that has no regard for the other side and that begins to treat the other side as being unimportant or merely an obstacle, as opposed to having a legitimate frame of reference with some important concerns that may need to be addressed. Sounds like our country, doesn't it? What we need today is so much more of what Rabbi Sachs represents in the world. That politicians should conduct themselves with statesman-like candor and seriousness. Not living for the soundbite or the political point scoring, but actually trying to lead our country carefully and understanding the sacred trust that they have taken on in taking on leadership and servanthood to our country as a result. It is not about the politicians. They serve us, the people. Rabbi Sachs understood this. Rabbi Sachs lived it out. Throughout his career, he was teaching us about leadership. I can highly recommend his book on leadership, drawing lessons from each of the Parshiot. I gave a copy of that book also to our president here, Ron Levitt, at Temple Beth El, so that we can think about those lessons of leadership. And I have frequently drawn upon that book for my own teaching. In fact, I owe probably a greater debt for the teachings that I've brought you and that I've brought in my former congregation to Rabbi Sachs than to anyone else, than to any other single individual. Even if I'm inspired by the ideas of other people on a more fundamental level in terms of my commitments, his presentation of the ideas has almost always guided my thinking on the Parsha. Rabbi Sachs understood that in order to preserve the blessings of liberty with which we have been blessed here in the West, we must also be careful to remember who we are and to work and indeed fight and indeed state our case and argue for protecting the context within which we enjoy the blessings of liberty and community here in these United States of America and across the West. And thinking about the story of Hanukkah, he drew the following lessons. Something to understand about Sachs was he thought about things in terms of the great sweeps of history. He understood the whole story of history. He would seldom see something within its narrow context of today. This is another reason that he was lifted to the level of being a statesman, not a mere politico. It was not about the short-term political football, which is almost everything you see in American media today. For him, it was about the achievements of the civilization. And he saw them come and go and move in dangerous directions, and he warned of the dangers, and he was a cheerleader for the positive directions that we were taking. Oftentimes able to speak very much as a prophet and also as a parliamentarian at the same time. Rabbi Sachs, speaking about what happened at Hanukkah, he said, "It was a fateful clash of civilizations when ancient Greece and Israel collided. The Jews won. Had they not done so, there would be no Judaism today, and there would almost certainly be no Christianity or Islam." See how the breadth and scope of history that he discusses there? Ancient Greece and Israel were profoundly different. The Greeks excelled at everything visual. The Jews worshipped an invisible God. To Greeks, the Jews were strange and superstitious. To Jews, the Greeks were pagans and idolaters. So he's handling the kind of clash of civilization that happened behind the story that we celebrate on Hanukkah, right? The Greeks introduced a gymnasium into Jerusalem. Young priests began to spend more time upon the body than the soul, and they encouraged Antiochus to forbid the public practice of Judaism, even erecting a statue of Zeus in the temple precincts. They began to offer pagan sacrifices there on the temple's altars. It was deeply provocative. The Jews called it an abomination of desolation. But then a priestly family, led by the aged Matthias and his sons, known later as the Maccabees, rose in revolt. They won back Jewish independence, cleansed, rededicated the temple, and relit the candelabrum, the menorah. That is why on this day, this is made for Hanukkah, right? We light candles for 8 days. And Hanukkah means rededication. Up to there, he has framed within a brilliant context of oratory what's at stake within the story of Hanukkah. And here he brings it home, showing his fundamental vision of leadership. What history taught them in that time was that to defend a country, you need an army. But to defend a civilization, you need schools. In the short run, battles are won by weapons, but in the long run, they are won by ideas and the way that they are handed on from generation to generation. Oddly, but appropriately, Hanukkah comes from the same Hebrew root as education. Chanukah, chinuch, right? Chet, nun, chaf, chinuch, education. And he says, referring to his own context, in Britain today we risk undervaluing and misunderstanding, misconstruing the purpose of school. We think of them in terms of league tables of academic results. But schools are so much more than this. They're the way that a civilization hands on its values, its teachings over time. When a culture forgets its own values, especially when it thinks they are something that we each invent for ourselves, that civilization is about to die. Not immediately, but inevitably. That is why faith schools have become popular. They have a strong and distinctive ethos. They honor the past. They create community and continuity. They teach children who they are and why. Hanukkah tells us that there are two different battles for freedom. One is fought by soldiers, the other by teachers. And it's the second that eventually determines the course of history. When civilizations clash, strengthen the schools. The world that we build tomorrow is born in the lessons that we teach today. Wow, what a vision. Rabbi Sachs is able to handle the history of Hanukkah in a way that it's immediately relevant for us now. And there's an achievable piece of work that we can do. Teach our story, hand on the Torah. Don't stop telling it just because you're told that everything is relative or that people don't do meta-narratives anymore. In a context like that, Rabbi Sachs stepped in with a big, story, a bold story, the Jewish story that he told in public again and again and inspired many Jewish leaders to do the same. At the end of the day, you can be remembered by people, or you can be remembered by the Torah that you teach. It was a moving thing to hear Rabbi Sachs's daughter, Gila, speak about how she will remember him. She didn't talk about the ideas that he gave. She engaged those regularly, and there was vital discussion around Torah in their house. But what she remembered him for was that as a father, despite his being a big public personality, he primarily took delight in their steps in growing up. He primarily made space for them to become the very different from himself individuals that they were becoming. And that as he grew older and older, it was his primary delight increasingly became them. These people in whom he had invested personally, whom he had loved, and whose lives he loved to see grow. We've talked about several ways you can be remembered: by your why, by your how you do or say things, by your progeny, by your Torah, that which you teach to others. When people remember you, they will probably primarily remember you either by your practices, the actions that you had, or by your manner of discussing ideas. I want to bless each of us this Shabbos, that following in the way that Rabbi Sachs has made as an example for us, that each of you should be blessed to speak your Torah, integrating your wisdom with the Torah of our tradition. I want to bless you that you should be able to meditate upon God's Torah every day, learning something new in it each time that you open the Parsha. And I want to bless you that you should address the needs of the moment within a view of things that last far beyond this current and passing moment. Shabbat Shalom.